I do apologise, we have to write the wrong side on this. May I first of all say what an honour it is to be invited to come to this conference, and I hope to be at many more. I would secondly like to thank your absolutely remarkable president, Professor Suad Musa, who I think you are extremely lucky to have leading. What I'm going to be talking about is to do with what children say. May I just ask if many of you have been involved in legal proceedings where interpreting what a child says matters? May I ask if many of you have? Because that's what this is very much to do with. Because you can look at what a child says in two different ways. One is, does it reflect what the child feels and thinks? Yes, if the child says it, and the voice of the child must be heard. Does it reflect objective reality outside that the courts or other people may want to take into account as evidence for things that have happened? We have a problem. And if we look in the UK, we would be aware that in the 1960s there was a huge philosophy of what the child said indicated, for example, if the child said anything relating to possible abuse, then it almost certainly, if there's a fire, if there's smoke, there was a fire. And the techniques concerned were called disclosure techniques. Disclosure means you find some way of getting the child to disclose what they were talking about. That's fine if something had happened, but if what they had said related to something else, it wasn't particularly good. There came something, I don't know if any of you have heard of the Cleveland inquiry, which occurred about a decade after that, where it was indicated that this was not the best policy. I'm looking at some of the techniques. Sorry, I'm going to take my watch off so I keep an eye on it because I don't want to make it too late for lunch. And following that, there was much greater caution. With underrepresentation, with under-identification of the significance of children's statements. And the pendulum has swung back and forth. I'd like to think that all of those in the profession would say, yes, we know. There are 13 inquiries into child abuse issues in the UK at this point in time, and many of them relate to what children have said. So I'm going to run very quickly through some of the issues and particularly try and give you examples of why they're of concern, because for most of you, you'll say, well, but these are issues we should know. First of all, can I just make sure that if a child says or does something that could be related to abuse, it doesn't mean to say, are you all familiar with the concepts of specificity and sensitivity? If what a child says can be related, let's say, to abuse, then there is a sensitivity, there's a correlation, but unless there is no other possible explanation, it is not specific. That should be a fairly basic concept, but people lose sight of this when we're talking about what children say. The next point I'd like to make very quickly is about children's memory. Again, I hope that you're all familiar with the fact that up to about the age of 3, memory from your early, you may try it yourselves and see what you can remember back. They're little fragments. It's very fragmented. 3 to 5, or up to maybe probably for the next few years, memory is less fragmented, but also not so much related to the context in which the events occurred. I hope you probably all are familiar with the concepts of memory development, but it even to some ways applies to ourselves. I won't do it to yourselves, but I used to play a trick on my students and say, when I came in, did you say I did such and such? And most of them say, oh yes, that's right. And I'd say, but I didn't. It's very easy to influence memory. So we need to be careful about assuming that what is said and what you feel is true memory is necessarily so. We should also be aware of the importance, well, we just talked about the child's development. I can give you a case example of this, where it was a police interview of a child in a legal case for legal purposes. And the policeman says to the child, you do know, this was I think a 5-year-old child, you do know, 6-year-old, you do know that you mustn't tell a lie, and the child smiled and nodded. That is a skirt you're wearing, the child smiles and nods, and you know that if you said they were trousers, that would be a lie, and the child smiles and nods. But this went on through the whole of the interview, asking questions about what had happened and what hadn't happened. But if you watch I watched the videotape, because I was asked by the courts to do so, what actually is happening is that the police officer is saying to the child, you do know that's a lie, and the child is copying the visual expression of the policeman, who hadn't checked because the child had extremely limited language and had no idea what the questions were. Now I'm saying this because one needs to remember that under these circumstances you need to make at least some sort of check on where the child's development is. You need to look at the child's mental health. It doesn't mean to say you have to do a comprehensive assessment, but to have at least have a look at the records. One child was brought to me because he had said he was a pubertal child and he a big boy, and he had said to somebody, he thinks a lot about his mother and sister, and it is to do with sex, and everything blew up. And when I saw him, I asked him, and he said, yes, that's right. But I actually remembered that I had seen him before, a few years before. He had difficulty in understanding what other people felt. He had actually had Asperger's, very typical Asperger's syndrome. And when I said to him, well, what would you do? He said, oh, well, I must tell you, I wouldn't do anything. There's no way, absolutely no way. So he had an incest taboo in place, and his problem was because he had Asperger's in appreciating the effect on other people what he said. And he said things publicly, because we do go through the process about sexual development in any case, but we don't, it's a subconscious thing, yeah? So here was the effect of his psychological problem on the way that he said, and people didn't take into account and therefore misinterpreted. We need to be aware also of the import of children's behavior. I'll try and I hope it's these are real cases I'm actually giving you. I hope it's of help to actually explain why these get mistaken. A child, a mother, and a young girl lived on the first floor flat. They were going up the stairs. An old man came out of the ground floor flat, put his hand on the girl's legs above her skirt, and all heavens broke loose. The man actually committed a crime. That's quite correct. The investigations asked the girl about what she felt about it and what she thought, and used sexual terms. Actually, the child thought the man was playing, and people were not careful in investigation and realized that their investigation was more sexualizing on the child than the actual event. Yes, he had committed a crime, but they need to be careful about understanding what the child's situation was and what her understanding was. There is the next point I'd like to make. I'm going to put up in a minute. Yeah, we're going to go quickly through some of these factors, which are factors which will affect the significance of what a child says and the ways in which they can make a difference. We're talking about some of the misinterpretations. Yes, misrepresentation, Johnson, or misinterpretation, it should say. Separated parents, children, a little boy, a little girl of 6 and a boy of 4 came home from visiting their father, and the girl said she wasn't that happy, and she said to her mother, "Daddy pooed on me." Yeah, Daddy defecated. That's not her word, but she said, "Daddy pooed on me." Mother went immediately. She was very concerned and she wasn't happy about the contact, and she went to social services, who said, did Daddy poo on you? Yes. This escalated, it got to court. I was actually asked by the court if I could repeat. And I saw the girl actually fairly late in the day. She was a bit tired and she was playing with the doll's house and she was playing with the little bathroom and I said, oh, what happened in the bathroom? And she said, Daddy pooed on me. I said, what? And we'll come to the question about avoiding leading questions. And she said, oh, my brother and I were sitting in the bath and Daddy came in and saw it on the carpet by the bath and said, who did that? And I said it wasn't me, and my brother said it wasn't him, so Daddy said, well, that only leaves me, so Daddy pooed on us. And this was the way in which, it may seem, well, this is silly, but it's surprising how often these misrepresentations get taken place because people have a pattern in the way that they think. It is very important. I'm going to try and do, yes, I'll be as quick as I can. Time sequencing is another problem that arises. One must be extremely careful, particularly if we're doing it for legal purposes. The case which I quote was of a boy who had been removed from his parents for abuse and placed in a children's home. And it was reported that he had said something nasty had happened, and it happened in the attic. And it, again, they investigated this. What happened? It happened in the attic. And this went to court. And I was actually sitting at the back where all the papers were spread out. And I looked, and there was it quoted that he had said to a social worker that a social worker had said that a friend of the boys had said it happened in the attic. And there it is in the right year, in the right month, 2 weeks before he ever went to the children's home. So yes, he was removed for abuse. Something happened in the attic. But the people had thought, because that was when he had first gone to the children's home, he was being abused in the children's home. That cost the country about £300,000 in legal proceedings, not compensation. So a time sequence, making a very, very careful time sequence of all events and all the factors that you know, and placing things like statements in the right place is extremely important. One of the factors that I would like to raise are, I don't know how much you look at this, but media has, certainly in the UK, over the last 10 years, longer. Elson wrote his book on media violence 40 years ago. I don't know if anybody has read it, about the fact that media, depending on the cultural and family environment, media can have a very significant effect on a child's behavior. And this is getting worse because the use in media games actually directly involves the child in an interaction, and many of them are violent. I saw a boy, teenage boy, in a secure prison. And he said, I said, what happened? And he said, well, I was on the street. He was actually, had been induced. Another thing we could look at sometimes is the way that drug dealers and drug producers capture young children and induce them, but he was selling drugs. I said, but what happened? Oh, well, there was the other guy who said I was on his territory. Yes. So I took out my knife. Why were you carrying a knife? But one does. And what did you do? Well, I stuck it in with anybody. Because in media games, young people are being taught that you do that on the game, and then you switch off and it's okay. And people underestimate the effect that participating in media violence has on children, that they lose the boundary of their behavior. I hope that makes sense. Right, so I'm going to say a few very quickly because lunch is coming up, we've got a couple more talks. If we are going to look at how you look at children's behavior or children's statements, first of all, you need to make sure that you have done some appraisal of the child's status. It doesn't have to be detailed, but if you think, yes, there could be a problem, then you may want to go and say we need a more detailed appraisal. So looking at them, considering the child's development, the basic appraisal of the child's mental state, their developmental state, etc., is very important. And people very often say, no, I'm here to carry out an interview of the child for legal purposes. No, you must check these things with the child. You need to look at the child's memory, and I put in there some of the factors concerned, the context in which it took place, the statement, the manner. By the way, are you all familiar with some of the very silly things which have happened with the manner of questioning children? I'm afraid the concept of disclosure, I don't know if anybody here still uses that concept. Yes, if you have a youngster to whom something has happened, to try and enable the child to say something, but as a basic thing, you are assuming that there's a way of getting it out of the child, direct questioning. One child, they said to the boy, well, when did your daddy do that? And he said, my daddy didn't do that. Well, yes, it's been said that well, I don't remember. He said, said the question, I've got this on tape somewhere. So we established that you don't remember it very well. Why would that be? The boy says, could have been asleep. All right, so it happened when you were asleep. And the manner of questioning, which was giving direct questions, which was inducing the child, one must be very, very careful to use open-ended questions, and to be very careful not to indicate to the child what answer you want. Let me press on. It is very important, by the way, to make sure that you have checked the spontaneity of the statements, because you will have, I could give you an example, I won't because it's a long time, but how a statement was taken, was changed slightly, and written down slightly differently, and then somebody read that, and was not looking at what the child actually said spontaneously to start with. So you must look at spontaneity. You need to look at who else is present. I presume that most of you have interviewed children by themselves and with a parent, because you look, if you see with the child is being interviewed with the parent present, you ask a question of the child, and the child looks towards the parent for approval or disapproval. So you need, if you're looking at the significance of what the child says, you need to be aware of who is present and who isn't. I don't know if, for legal purposes, you know exactly who would be questioning the children, because I'm afraid an awful lot of people question children who are not trained in these areas, and will make, it isn't making all mistakes, they won't know what the dangers can be. And I'm going to, because time is thundering by, I'm going to come to the last thing. Please, if you do this, consider all other possible explanations, and if you exclude them, give the reasons why. Now, the purpose of looking at all of this is not to get people off where there might be child's evidence. If you do this, again, if you appear in court, I wouldn't say necessarily I'm the expert on court work, but I've been in about 1,500 cases, so I have a little experience in this area. If you want your evidence to be clear when something nasty has happened to a child, about your interpretation of what the child says, if you are careful, believe me, you can get an awful lot more nasty people convicted than if you give evidence that is affected by all of these factors. I hope that's of some help.